The wind here has a name, and the name is a warning. Fishermen and pilots up and down the Aleutian chain call it a willy-waw, a sudden blast of cold air that drops off a mountainside with almost no notice and can hit a boat or a small plane at speeds close to 140 miles an hour. There's no siren for it, no red sky, no rolling thunder, no 5 minutes to get ready. One moment the water is flat enough to see your own reflection in it, and the next, a wall of air is flattening that reflection sideways, spray torn straight off the top of the swell before it can even break. Pilots who fly the mail routes between these islands will tell you, if you ask them directly and let them finish the answer, that the wind is the real authority out here, not the FAA, not the National Weather Service, not the schedule taped to the wall of the hangar. It decides who flies today and who doesn't. It decides whether a fishing boat makes it back to harbor by dinner or spends the night riding out swells in the dark with the engine straining just to hold position against a current that won't let go. It has decided more than once whether someone lives or dies, and it has done that in under a minute, with no warning that a person standing on the dock could have actually used. Think about what that actually means for daily life, not as an abstraction but as a Tuesday. A village runs out of insulin and the plane that carries it can't land for 6 days straight. A grandmother needs a procedure only available in Anchorage, and the only aircraft capable of reaching her is grounded by a storm nobody can predict with any real precision more than a few hours out. A barge loaded with a winter's worth of heating fuel sits at anchor 20 miles offshore, waiting for a window that keeps closing before it opens. None of that is rare out here. It's closer to routine. The background hum of a place where the calendar tells you what should happen and the sky tells you what actually will. Multiply that single village by every small settlement strung along this same coastline from the Alaska Peninsula out to the last inhabited island near the Russian border, and you start to see the actual shape of what this film is investigating. Not one remote outpost, but an entire working region of the United States that runs on a completely different relationship with time and weather than almost anywhere else in the country. None of what's actually strange about this is a ghost story either. In an age when a phone in your pocket can show you a satellite photograph of your own driveway, updated within the hour, there are inhabited pieces of the United States that functionally disappear for days or weeks at a stretch. Not because anyone is hiding them, because the weather physically will not let a boat, a plane, or in some cases even a radio signal through. Ask people on the mainland what's out past Kodiak, past Dutch Harbor, past the last town most Americans could actually name on a map, and you'll get a shrug or a joke about crab fishing or nothing at all. Ask the people who live on those islands the same question, and something interesting happens. They don't lean in and lower their voices like they're about to hand you a secret. They tend to look almost bored by the question, the way you'd look bored if a stranger asked you to explain your own street corner. And that gap between how little the rest of the country knows about this coastline and how little the people closest to it seem to want to perform about it is the actual subject of this film. So let's be precise about what hiding means here, because the word is doing two very different jobs, and it's worth separating them before we go any further. There's the hiding that happens because something is physically out of reach, buried under fog for most of the year, sealed behind military restriction, sitting hundreds of miles from the nearest port with no scheduled way to get there at all. That kind of hiding is physical, and it's honest, and it can be measured in clear days per year or nautical miles between ports. Then there's the hiding that comes from silence, from communities who know exactly what's out there, and simply don't narrate it for outsiders, because for them, it isn't a mystery. It's Tuesday. Grief doesn't announce itself as content. Neither does a hazard you learned to live around before you were old enough to read the warning sign yourself. We're going to test both kinds against the documented record, island by island, along one long arc of coastline, and see what's actually there once the assumptions get stripped away. It's worth naming the popular version of this mystery directly, so we can set it aside honestly rather than tiptoe around it. There's a well-known piece of pop folklore, sometimes called the Alaska Triangle, usually mapped across the interior wilderness between towns like Anchorage, Juneau, and Utqiagvik, far to the north. Blamed at various points on shifting energy vortexes, ancient shape-shifting spirits out of Tlingit oral tradition, and every flavor of aircraft-swallowing conspiracy theory in between. That region isn't the subject of this film, and it isn't even the same part of the state as the island chain we're actually following. So let's be honest about where the myth actually lives on a map before we go looking for its cousin out here. But the underlying mechanism driving that legend, an enormous, physically punishing wilderness where a downed plane or a lost hiker can be buried under snow and simply never found again, is close cousin to exactly what we're about to walk through along the islands, minus the vortexes and the shapeshifters. Scale, weather, and brutal terrain explain plenty on their own, without a single supernatural add-on required. And that's the version of the mystery worth actually investigating. There's a real cost to reaching for the paranormal version first, too, beyond just being wrong. It flattens actual grief and actual danger into entertainment, and it trains an audience to expect a monster instead of a mechanism, which makes the true documented explanation feel like a letdown the moment it finally arrives, instead of the far more interesting answer it actually is. Start with the shape of the place, because almost nobody holds it correctly in their head, and a wrong map makes everything that follows harder to trust. The Aleutian Islands are not a handful of dots off the coast of Alaska. They're an arc of roughly 300 islands and islets, stretching about 1,200 miles from the Alaska Peninsula almost all the way to Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, close enough at the far end that the westernmost point of the United States and the easternmost edge of Russian territory sit only a couple hundred miles apart, a distance you could cover by boat in a single day in calm water, which this particular stretch of ocean almost never offers. The chain sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, a boundary where one tectonic plate is being forced under another at a slow, continuous grind that never really stops, which means active volcanoes rising straight out of cold water, several of them among the most perfectly symmetrical cones on the planet, all of them capable of reshaping the coastline they sit on with no warning beyond a tremor nobody on the mainland will ever feel. Nearly none of these islands carry trees. Past a certain point along the chain, the wind simply won't allow anything taller than knee-high tundra grass and low shrub to survive, which means the landscape reads as open and rolling in every direction. Green in summer, gray-brown the rest of the year, offering no windbreak at all to whatever the sky decides to throw at it. Aleutians who have lived along this arc for thousands of years have their own name for the weather that governs it: the birthplace of the winds. That's not a phrase invented for a brochure. It's a working description of a place where the warm North Pacific and the cold Bering Sea collide directly along this line of islands, and the collision produces some of the most violent, changeable weather anywhere on Earth outside the poles, strong enough that it shapes storm patterns thousands of miles away across the rest of North America, not just the local forecast. It's worth sitting with one more piece of deep time before moving forward, because it flips the whole premise of this investigation on its head for a moment. Most researchers studying how humans first reached the Americas point toward a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska across what's now the Bering Strait, the same stretch of water the Diomede Islands sit inside today, exposed during past ice ages when sea levels dropped low enough to walk across. In other words, this entire supposedly hidden corner of the country isn't a dead end at the edge of the map. By the best evidence available, it's closer to a front door, the very route through which people first arrived on this continent at all, thousands of years before anyone called it Alaska or the United States or anything else. The Bering Sea and Bering Strait both carry the name of a man this exact stretch of ocean eventually killed. Vitus Bering, the Danish navigator sailing for Russia who first charted this region for Europe in 1741, We know Troway Wicharensimashim made it home from Alaska's coast, only to be shipwrecked on the return voyage, stranded through a brutal winter on an island near Kamchatka, and dead of scurvy that December, one of roughly 30 men his expedition lost to the same disease. The very body of water named in his honor is the reason he never survived it. Even for the first European ever to map this region, the water and the winter did the same thing to him. It has done to nearly everyone else in this film. It decided the ending, on its own schedule, regardless of anyone's plans. Stay with that ring of fire for one more moment before we start moving island to island, because it's doing more work in this story than a single sentence can carry. At any given time, Alaska typically has 1 or 2 volcanoes actively erupting somewhere along its arc, more than any other state by a wide margin, and in August of 2021, 3 separate volcanoes were erupting simultaneously along this same stretch: Great Sitkin, Semisopochnoi, and Pavlov on the Alaska Peninsula, an unusually busy stretch even by this region's own standards. Great Sitkin's eruption that year sent lava slowly filling its summit crater and spilling into the valley below, activity that continued for years afterward with barely a headline anywhere outside Alaska. Pavlov alone has recorded more than 40 eruptions through its documented history, making it one of the most consistently active volcanoes anywhere in the entire arc. Unimak Island, the largest in the whole chain and the same island that lost 5 lighthouse keepers to a tsunami in 1946, carries the tallest peak in the Aleutians on its back, Mount Shishaldin, rising more than 9,000 feet straight out of the sea. Its slopes so evenly cone-shaped above roughly 6,000 feet that geologists consider it the most symmetrical volcano anywhere along the entire arc, glacier-draped and quietly active, with at least 40 confirmed eruptions recorded over the last 10,000 years. And here's the detail that belongs at the center of this investigation rather than at its edge. The Alaska Volcano Observatory has no ground-based monitoring instruments at all on roughly 17 of the state's active volcanoes, most of them scattered across this same remote chain. For those 17, the agency depends on satellite imagery, on pilot reports radioed in by commercial flights passing overhead, and on ordinary residents, fishing crews, and Coast Guard patrols who happen to notice smoke or ash and call it in. In other words, for a meaningful stretch of American volcanic territory, the actual early warning system depends less on a seismometer bolted into the rock than on a person who happens to be looking in the right direction at the right moment. On a coastline where looking in the right direction is itself a genuine act of luck, given how often the sky simply refuses to let anyone see anything at all. None of this weather stays put out here either, and that turns out to matter to people who will never see these islands in their lives. Meteorologists have a name for the semi-permanent low-pressure system that parks itself over the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska for much of the year: the Aleutian Low, one of the 2 or 3 dominant engines that steer storm tracks across the entire North Pacific. Systems that spin up along this chain don't stay local. They ride the jet stream east and south, arriving days later as the rain that soaks Seattle, the snow that piles up in the Cascades, sometimes the moisture-feeding storms that reach as far as the Rockies before finally spending themselves. Forecasters on the mainland watching a system approach the West Coast are, more often than most people realize, watching the tail end of weather that was born days earlier over an island most of their viewers couldn't name. So the fog that swallows Attu for 350 days a year does more than inconvenience the people under it. It's an upstream ingredient in weather patterns that affect tens of millions of people who will spend their entire lives thinking of the Pacific Northwest's weather as something that simply happens to them. With no idea it was assembled first over a stretch of ocean they've never once had reason to look at on a map. Even the sky above these islands can turn against radio communication, which is worth knowing given how much of this film depends on the phrase "a radio signal couldn't get through." At these high latitudes, the same magnetic field lines that paint the aurora across the winter sky also bend and disturb the upper atmosphere in ways that can degrade or blot out high-frequency radio and satellite communication entirely during a strong solar or geomagnetic event, a real, well-documented physical phenomenon, not folklore. So even when the fog lifts, even when the wind finally drops low enough for a boat to move safely, there are nights when the sky itself adds one more layer between an island and the rest of the world. Not because of any secrecy at all, but because a star 93 million miles away is having a bad day. Winter itself narrows the working day before any of that even comes into play. This far north and this far west, December brings barely 6 or 7 hours of usable daylight, gray and low on the horizon even at noon, which means every flight, every boat launch, every outdoor repair has to be squeezed into a shrinking window before dark takes the rest of the day back, on top of everything the wind and the fog were already taking. We're going to move along this arc the way a lot of the real history moved along it, roughly west to east, island by island, and at each stop we'll test an assumption against the record. Some of what's hiding turns out to be exactly what you'd expect once the mechanism gets explained plainly: fog, distance, cold water, a coastline that swallows a radio signal whole. Some of it is stranger and heavier, and considerably more human than a monster ever could be. And more than once, what looks from a distance like secrecy turns out, on closer inspection, to be something closer to grief that simply never asked to be turned into a story. Before the first island, it's worth spending one more moment on the wind itself, because it's the mechanism underneath almost everything that follows. A willy-waw forms when cold, dense air pools high on a mountainside, in the snow and ice fields that top out most of these volcanic peaks, and then gets pulled downhill by gravity alone, compressing and accelerating as it funnels through a valley or a pass toward the sea below. It's the same basic physics behind the katabatic winds recorded in Antarctica and in the Strait of Magellan at the bottom of South America. But the Aleutians produce some of the most violent and best documented examples anywhere on the planet. Gusts clocked at more than 120 knots in places, a speed that would qualify as a strong Category 4 hurricane if it arrived with any of the advance warning a hurricane normally provides. Aviation safety authorities list willy-waws as a known regional hazard specifically because they don't follow a weather front, don't reliably show up on a standard forecast, and can turn a routine short hop between two islands into a genuine emergency inside of 90 seconds flat. That's the baseline condition every single story on this route has to be measured against. Before you get to war, before you get to famine, before you get to a nuclear test buried under an island, you have to understand that anyone who has ever tried to build a life out here first had to make peace with a sky that reserves the right to change its mind without ever asking permission. The fog and the instruments don't always agree with each other either, and one night in the summer of 1943 proves it in a way that still shows up in naval history classes today. On the 27th of July, roughly 90 miles southwest of Kiska, a group of American battleships and cruisers picked up 7 unknown radar contacts through the murk and opened fire, convinced they'd found an approaching Japanese fleet. Over the next several minutes, those ships fired more than 500 14-inch shells and nearly 500 8-inch rounds into the fog, an enormous, sustained bombardment against targets that never fired back and never moved the way a real fleet would. When the sun came up and a search team went out to confirm the kill, they found nothing. Not a single piece of wreckage, not an oil slick, not, in the words of one Navy historian afterward, even a dead whale. No Japanese ships had been anywhere near that stretch of water. The leading explanation ever since is that the radar had locked onto nothing more than reflections off the surrounding mountains, or possibly a large flock of migrating seabirds moving low over the water at exactly the wrong moment. An entire naval task force spent real ammunition fighting an enemy that the weather itself had invented. If you want a single image for how thoroughly this environment can conceal the truth, even from radar built specifically to see through darkness and distance, that's it. A battle fought at full intensity against something that was never there at all. What strikes me most about that story has less to do with the wasted ammunition and more to do with the crews themselves. Experienced, trained, looking directly at hard data on a screen, and still fed a completely convincing lie by the environment around them. If a coastline can do that to a warship's radar, it should lower anyone's confidence about how easily a rumor, once it starts circulating about a place this hard to actually verify, could survive unchallenged for decades. Begin the real route now at the far western edge of the chain, on Attu Island, because Attu carries the reputation that gets attached to a lot of these places by people who have never been near them. The haunted island, the ghost island, the place where nobody lives because something is wrong with it. The bored, matter-of-fact truth is both plainer and heavier than that. Nobody lives on Attu today for reasons you can trace through actual paperwork, not folklore, and the paper trail starts with the sky itself. Attu sits under some of the heaviest, most persistent cloud cover anywhere in the Aleutian chain. Climate records for the island describe somewhere between 8 and 10 cloud-free days across an entire year. Not 8 or 10 clear weeks, 8 or 10 clear days out of 365, with most of the remainder split between rain, fog thick enough to swallow a mountain a few hundred yards away, and wind on top of both. That single fact decided the outcome of a battle here, and it decided the fate of the island's last permanent residents. And it's still the reason almost nobody sets foot on Attu today, outside of the rare birder chasing a vagrant Asian species blown across the Bering Sea by exactly the kind of storm system this island specializes in producing. In June of 1942, in the same week as the Battle of Midway, and almost entirely eclipsed by it in American memory ever since, Japanese forces landed on Attu and on its neighbor Kiska, occupying American soil for the first and only time during the Second World War. On Attu, they found a small Aleut village, and they took 45 villagers prisoner, along with an American couple who had been running the island's weather station. The same station that existed precisely because someone on the mainland needed to know what this weather was doing before it reached them. Those 45 people were shipped to a prisoner of war camp at Otaru, on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, and held there for the remainder of the war. 16 of them died in that camp, from disease and from hunger, before the survivors were finally released in 1945. What happened next is the part almost nobody outside Alaska knows, and it's the hinge the whole rest of this story turns on. When the surviving Attuans made the long journey home, through the Philippines, through San Francisco, up to Seattle, they were told they would not be allowed to return to Attu at all. The United States government had decided that rebuilding a village destroyed by war on an island this remote, and Aimedishurur, cost more than it was willing to spend on people who had already lost their homes fighting a war that wasn't theirs to begin with. The survivors were resettled instead on Atka, a different island, among a different community they had no prior connection to. And Attu's village was never reoccupied. Not that year, not the next decade, not ever. It sits empty today, not because of anything supernatural. It's empty because of a wartime tragedy, followed by a peacetime accounting decision made about 80 years ago that nobody in Washington has ever bothered to reverse. The recapture of Attu itself, in May of 1943, cost roughly 549 American lives against a Japanese garrison that was almost entirely destroyed, something on the order of 2,350 men, in brutal, freezing, Close quarters fighting across terrain that gave neither side any real cover from that relentless weather. Frostbite casualties on the American side alone ran into the hundreds, men losing fingers and toes to cold before they ever fired a shot in anger. A detail that tells you almost everything about which enemy actually did the most damage on this island. Many of those troops had shipped north from training grounds in warmer climates, issued gear that had never been tested against a wind like this one, learning the specific cost of that mismatch in real time, on frozen ground, under fire. It remains the only land battle fought on incorporated United States territory during the entire war. And here's a detail that should stop you for a second. Almost nobody can name it. Ask most Americans to name a Second World War battle fought on their own soil, and you will get silence or you'll get Pearl Harbor, which was a naval and air attack, not a ground battle at all. Attu simply isn't in the story most people were told, and the reason comes down to distance, bad timing against a far more decisive battle happening the same week a few thousand miles south, and an island so remote that even the government that fought and won there mostly wanted to move on from it afterward. Attu didn't stay entirely empty right away, and the way it finally did says almost everything about how these decisions actually get made out here. For decades after the war, a small detachment of Coast Guardsmen, usually numbering around 20, kept a long-range navigation station running on the island, part of a network that helped ships and aircraft fix their position before satellite navigation existed. That station stayed staffed straight through the 1950s, the 1970s, the end of the Cold War, and into the 21st century, a tiny, rotating human presence on an island most Americans had already forgotten existed. It wasn't shut down because of anything happening on Attu itself. It closed in late August of 2010, decommissioned along with the last of the Coast Guard's long-range navigation network nationwide, because GPS had quietly made the entire technology obsolete everywhere at once. When those 20 men packed up and left, Attu passed from occupied to uninhabited for a second time in less than 70 years. And this time, there was no war attached to it at all, no invasion, no headline. Just a budget line and a satellite constellation making one very lonely posting unnecessary. It's worth following the Attuans one more step before moving on, because their story doesn't just end in a resettlement order, it continues out loud on Atka Island today. Atka sits roughly 90 miles east of Adak, 1,100 miles from Anchorage, and it remains the only inhabited community anywhere in the Central Aleutians. A single village of a little over 50 people at last count, nearly all of them Unangan. Archaeological evidence shows people living on Atka Island for at least 2,000 years, inside a broader Aleutian occupation stretching back over 8,000, and the Aleut language is still spoken in roughly a quarter of homes there today, an actively maintained inheritance rather than a museum exhibit. This is where the Attu survivors were sent when Washington decided their own village wasn't worth rebuilding, dropped into a community that had its own history, its own families, its own claim on the same stretch of ocean, and told to make it work. Descendants of both communities live there together now, fishing the same waters, and Atka's own church, like Unalaska's cathedral, still holds services rooted in that same Russian Orthodox tradition brought over centuries ago. One more sign of continuity carried forward by choice rather than left behind by accident. It's a useful corrective to hold on to. The story of these islands isn't only a list of things that ended. Sometimes it's a list of things that got rebuilt somewhere else entirely, quietly, by people nobody in Washington ever thought to check back in on. Move roughly 200 miles east and you reach Kiska. And Kiska is where the physical mechanism of hiding stops being a figure of speech, because fog didn't just obscure this island's history, it actively hid an entire army from the force that had been sent specifically to destroy it. The Japanese garrison on Kiska had spent more than a year fortifying the island, eventually digging something in the neighborhood of 10,000 feet of tunnels through volcanic rock, enough to move troops and supplies underground across most of the harbor area, without a single soldier having to step into the open air. Some of those tunnels still stand today, cut straight through volcanic rock, cold and dripping, wide enough in places to have run field telephone lines and stored ammunition dumps well below anything a naval bombardment from offshore could reach. An entire garrison had effectively built itself a second invisible island underneath the visible one, and for over a year that hidden layer functioned exactly as intended. By the summer of 1943, with Attu retaken and an enormous Allied invasion force gathering to do the same to Kiska, Japanese commanders made the decision to pull the garrison out rather than fight a battle they knew they'd lose. On the 29th of July, 1943, under deep fog and full darkness, a Japanese naval force under Rear Admiral Kimura Masatomi slipped straight through the American blockade that was supposed to be sealing the island shut, and evacuated more than 5,000 men, close to 5,193 without a single American ship spotting them. The weather that makes this chain so dangerous to live in also, on that particular night, made an entire garrison vanish from under the noses of a fleet built specifically to prevent exactly that. 2.5 weeks later, on the 15th of August, a massive Allied invasion force landed on Kiska ready for a fight. There was nobody there. In the fog and confusion of an assault against an island that had already been quietly abandoned, jumpy Allied troops fired on each other in the mist, unable to tell a shadow moving through the gray from an actual enemy soldier, and at least 28 men were killed by friendly fire, with a further 4 killed by Japanese booby traps left behind in the tunnels. Days later, a destroyer supporting the operation, the USS Abner Red, struck a floating mine and lost 71 more men, its stern torn away and sent to the bottom of the Bering Sea near Kiska, where it sat unlocated for 75 years until maritime archaeologists finally found the wreckage resting roughly 290 feet down. One more piece of this coastline's history that had simply been waiting, patiently, for someone with the right equipment and the right weather window to go looking. An island already empty produced well over 100 casualties in a battle fought against nobody, because the same fog that had let the Japanese escape unseen also made it impossible for the men who came after them to tell friend from shadow. If you want one story that shows exactly how thoroughly weather can conceal something in these islands, that's it. It hit a retreating army from a blockade built to stop it, and it very nearly finished off the men who arrived to fight a war that, by the time they landed, had already ended there without them. Kiska is essentially unvisited today, and the honest reason comes down to ordnance, not mystery. Decades of shelling and 2 separate occupying forces left the island seeded with unexploded material that has never been fully cleared, and it's routinely listed among the most heavily contaminated, unexploded ordnance sites under federal management anywhere in the country. That's not folklore either. That's a hazard classification, the kind that shows up in an engineering report rather than a campfire story, and it's the actual, unglamorous, thoroughly documented reason nobody is building a dock there. Step back from Attu and Kiska for a moment and look at the entire Aleutian campaign's casualty ledger as one number, because it makes the same argument this whole film keeps circling back to more bluntly than any single battle can. American forces suffered close to 3,800 casualties across the campaign, and of those, 549 died in actual combat. The rest, well over 3,000 men, were lost to frostbite, trench foot, hypothermia, sickness, and the sheer psychological weight of holding a position in weather like this for months at a stretch, with the environment itself accounting for more damage than the entire Japanese army managed to inflict. Put plainly, the single deadliest force in this campaign never fired a shot, and it's the exact same force this film opened with, still blowing down the same ridgelines today that most people asked about it can't even name. Not every island along this stretch stayed empty, and the next stop shows what happens when a war reaches a place people were actually living, working, and raising children. On the 3rd and 4th of June, 1942, in the same operation that put troops on Attu and Kiska, Japanese carrier aircraft bombed Dutch Harbor, the port town on Unalaska Island, and by far the largest settlement anywhere near this end of the chain. The raids killed 43 Americans and wounded roughly 50 more, with the worst single loss coming when planes hit a naval barracks at Margaret Bay and killed 25 servicemen in one strike. 70 bombs fell across those 2 days, fuel tanks burned, and a beached vessel being used as civilian housing took a direct hit. Survivors who lived through it later described the strange, specific terror of an attack arriving out of weather this thick. The drone of engines somewhere above a ceiling of cloud you couldn't see through. No visual warning at all, until the first explosion told you the raid had already started. The same fog that grounds a mail plane on an ordinary Tuesday turned, for 2 days that June, into cover for an actual air raid on American soil. It's worth sitting with that reversal for a second. The exact weather this film keeps treating as a source of safety through distance and difficulty of access was, for those 2 specific days, the thing that let an enemy get close enough to strike at all. The same mechanism cuts both ways, protection and exposure, depending only on which direction the danger happens to be coming from. In Unalaska today, that raid gets a name and a date on the local calendar. An annual Remembrance Day almost nobody outside Alaska has ever heard of, precisely because it happened the same week as Midway and got swallowed whole by a bigger, more decisive battle a few thousand miles south. In 1996, Congress finally designated a small stretch of Amiknak Island, right beside Dutch Harbor, as the Aleutian World War II National Historic Area, built around Fort Schwatka, the highest coastal artillery battery ever constructed in the United States. Its concrete bunkers engineered specifically to survive both earthquakes and winds over 100 miles an hour. The park's own materials describe this campaign using a phrase historians have used for decades: the Forgotten War, a fight where American servicemen faced the Japanese and the weather at the same time, while 1,000 miles away in a cannery converted into a camp, the people whose home this actually was sat waiting for permission to go back to it. Naming a war, forgotten 50 years after the fact, and then building a park to say so out loud is its own small, honest admission that the silence around these islands was never really a secret. It was simply an oversight nobody got around to correcting until half a century had already gone by. Locally, the memory is alive and simply sized correctly to the community that actually lived through it, which is a different thing entirely from being buried or hidden. There's a real irony sitting inside this one, too. Dutch Harbor is today the single highest volume fishing port in the entire United States by weight of catch landed, holding that title for more than 2 decades running, with well over 600 million pounds of seafood crossing its docks in a recent year alone, worth on the order of $160 million. Most of it ordinary pollock destined for fish sticks and sandwich fillets, rather than the glamorous king crab the television cameras always seem to find. It's a place that anyone who has ever watched a television show about Bering Sea crab boats has already seen without necessarily knowing it. It's a place millions of people have watched hours of footage of and still couldn't point to on a map, which is its own quiet kind of hidden, no fog required. What that same footage rarely spells out in plain numbers is exactly how dangerous the underlying work still is. Through the late 1990s, the Bering Sea crab fleet was losing something like 8 fishermen a year on a workforce small enough that the resulting death rate ran into the hundreds per 100,000 workers, a level that made it, by a wide margin, one of the most lethal jobs in the entire country. Most of those deaths Simple drowning after a vessel capsized or a man went overboard into water cold enough to be fatal within minutes. A shift to a quota-based season starting in 2006, giving each boat its own set share instead of forcing a mad, weather-be-damned scramble against every other boat during a short open season, cut the fatality rate dramatically almost overnight, down to less than one death a year in the seasons that followed. That's not a story about the sea being unknowable. It's a story about a knowable, measurable risk that got safer once the people managing the fishery changed one specific rule, a far less mysterious kind of lesson than the one the reality television version tends to sell. And right in the middle of Unalaska, above the harbor, sits a building that tells a quieter, older version of the same story about who actually gets to decide what a place becomes. The Church of the Holy Ascension traces back to 1808, when Russian fur traders built a small octagonal chapel here not long after they first arrived, and the current cathedral, raised in 1894, is recognized today as the oldest cruciform cathedral anywhere in North America. Services are still sung there in 3 languages: Unangam Tunu, the Aleut language itself, Church Slavonic, and English, side by side in the same liturgy, generation after generation. It's easy to treat Russian colonization of these islands as a closed chapter, something that ended cleanly when the United States bought Alaska in 1867. The cathedral says otherwise. It says a foreign power's religion arrived here, took root, got translated into a native language by a priest willing to actually learn it, and became something the community carries forward on its own terms, rather than something it was simply left holding. That's not hidden either. It's on the National Register of Historic Landmarks, photographed by every cruise ship that passes through the harbor. It's just rarely connected, in most people's minds, to the same coastline that produced every other story in this film. The Unangax people of these islands paid for that same invasion in a way that had nothing to do with combat. Within weeks of the attack, the United States government evacuated 881 Unangax residents from 9 villages across the region, giving some of them as little as 24 hours' notice to leave everything they owned behind, marched onto ships bound for a place 1,500 miles from anything they had ever known. They were shipped south to 6 sites in southeast Alaska that officials called refugee camps: a cannery, and an old gold mine at Funter Bay, a herring reduction plant at Killisnoo, a civilian conservation corps camp at Ward Lake, a cannery at Burnett Inlet, and a tented encampment at the Wrangell Institute, a federal boarding school built a decade earlier for Native children that, for the length of the war, doubled as a holding site for evacuated adults it was never designed to house. Conditions varied by camp, but none of them were good, and the death tolls tell their own story with no need for embellishment. 32 people died at Funter Bay, 17 died at Killisnoo, 20 died at Ward Lake, 5 died at Burnett Inlet. Most of those deaths came from tuberculosis and other disease, spreading fast through buildings with no running water, no reliable heat, and in several cases no electricity at all, through winters that southeast Alaska makes no exceptions for. Survivors' own accounts, collected decades later by park historians, describe families crowded into single rooms in structures that had been condemned as fish processing buildings years before anyone was ever expected to live in them, walls that let the wind straight through, and children walking past open latrine pits on their way to whatever passed for a classroom. These weren't hardships that simply happened to unlucky people in an unlucky place. They were hardships imposed by a government evacuation plan that never adequately funded the destinations it was sending people to, a gap between the order and the resources to carry it out safely that cost lives on its own, entirely separate from the war that supposedly justified the order in the first place. Some of those home villages were never rebuilt afterward once the war ended. The same pattern that emptied Attu repeating itself quietly across the whole region, camp after camp, name after name, family after family. Decades later, in 1988, the United States government formally apologized and provided compensation under federal legislation, $12,000 to each surviving evacuee, an acknowledgement that took over 40 years, and a dollar figure that could never actually equal what was taken, to arrive after the fact. If you're looking for why Alayot and Unangak's elders don't treat this history as an adventure story worth performing for a camera, that's why. It's a documented, government-acknowledged injustice, and it sits inside living family memory, filed on a shelf entirely separate from legend. Push further out along the chain, past the point where most maps of Alaska simply run out of room to print a label, and you reach Shemya, an island smaller than most American college campuses that happens to sit closer to Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula than to mainland Alaska. Shemya is home to Erickson Air Station and to a piece of hardware most Americans have never heard of and were never meant to, the Cobra Dane radar, a single enormous phased array installation built to track ballistic missile tests launched from Soviet and later Russian territory a few hundred miles away. It's an intelligence-gathering system, not a museum piece, still active, still classified in significant part, sitting beside a runway more than 10,000 feet long that was built to handle heavy military aircraft rather than tourists. The island's population is measured in dozens of rotating personnel rather than families, and its weather is, if anything, worse than Attu's, socked in by fog and storm for the vast majority of the year. Personnel rotate through on fixed tours rather than settling in, which means the island has essentially no local civilian population at all to interview, no elders, no fishing families, nobody with generational memory of the place, because by design nobody stays long enough to build one. Whatever Shemya is hiding, it isn't hiding it from a community that simply prefers not to talk. There's no community there in the first place, only a mission, and the people rotated through to run it. There's a small, almost comic geographic footnote sitting just past Shemya that most Americans have never once considered, because the Aleutian chain crosses the 180th meridian, the same line the international date line generally follows. One small Aleutian island, Semisopochnoi, technically sits in the eastern hemisphere and counts as the easternmost point of the entire United States by longitude, while another Aleutian island, Amatignac, sits just on the other side of that same line and counts as the westernmost point. Alaska holds both records simultaneously on two islands most residents of the state itself couldn't find on a map, purely because the coastline curves so far west that it eventually wraps back around and starts counting as east again. Nobody talks about what's on Shemya, because almost nobody who's ever been stationed there is allowed to. And the handful who could tell you anything meaningful have signed paperwork that makes the silence a condition of employment rather than a personality trait. That's a different flavor of hidden than anything covered so far. Not distance alone, and not grief, but a security clearance standing between you and an answer, one that's bounded, accountable, and reviewed on a schedule, rather than a rumor with no author anyone can name. Every so often, a piece of that mission does surface publicly anyway. A budget line in a congressional report, a contractor notice, a general's testimony before a committee, and each time it does, the story turns out to be exactly what the shape of the place already suggested: expensive, technical, and entirely explainable. Never the thing conspiracy forums built it up to be. A few hundred miles back toward the mainland sites an island with a very different kind of silence, one built entirely underground. Amchitka Island, 43 miles long, was the site of 3 separate underground nuclear weapons tests conducted by the United States government between the mid-1960s and 1971. The first long shot went off in 1965 at a yield of about 80 kilotons, built specifically to help scientists learn to tell a nuclear test apart from an ordinary earthquake on seismic instruments. The second, Milrow, followed in 1969 at roughly 1,000 kilotons, testing whether the island's rock could safely absorb a blast that size before anyone dared go bigger still. Then came the largest of the three, codenamed Kanakin, and detonated on the 6th of November, 1971, with a yield of nearly 5 megatons, something like 400 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, making it the largest underground nuclear explosion the United States has ever conducted, set off at the bottom of a shaft drilled almost 6,000 feet into volcanic rock on an island scientists already knew sat on some of the most tectonically unstable ground in the country. The blast lifted the ground surface above it and then let it fall back roughly 20 feet, and it left behind a crater roughly a mile wide that's still visible from the air today. The test drew fierce opposition specifically because of that instability. Opposition significant enough that the organization that grew directly out of the campaign against it eventually became Greenpeace, one of the largest environmental groups in the world, founded by people whose first real fight was trying to stop a bomb from going off on a piece of ground most of them had never seen and never would. A chartered fishing boat renamed Greenpeace for the occasion actually sailed for Amchitka in September of 1971, loaded with activists trying to physically reach the test site before the detonation, and got turned back by the United States Coast Guard before it ever got close enough to matter. Even a direct organized attempt to bear witness to what was happening on this island ran straight into the same wall of distance and restriction that every other story in this film keeps running into. Amchitka today is closed to casual visitors and remains under long-term environmental monitoring for radiological contamination, decades after the last test was ever conducted. Workers who were stationed there during the testing years have spoken publicly about lingering unease even now, not folklore exactly, but a documented specific worry about groundwater and containment that has outlived the Cold War that caused it by half a century and counting. This is hiding of a third kind again. Not fog, not grief, not clearance paperwork, but a genuine physical legacy buried underground, monitored quietly by people whose job is precisely to keep checking, rarely, if ever, connected in the public imagination to American soil at all. From Amchitka, the chain eventually leads to Adak, and Adak is where Cold War secrecy meets ordinary, present-tense, small-town life in a way that's almost disorienting to actually witness. During the Cold War, Adak became one of the most important and most classified American military installations in the Pacific, a naval air station built specifically to track Soviet submarines moving through the Bering Sea and the North Pacific. At its peak, the base and its support population numbered in the thousands, a genuine functioning town with a movie theater, a bowling alley, schools, and streets carrying ordinary mainland-style names. Sitting on an island so far out that most of the men and women stationed there had never even heard of it before their orders arrived in the mail. The Navy closed the facility in 1997, and Adak's population collapsed along with it almost overnight. The 2020 census counted 171 residents, down from 326 just a decade earlier. And the town today is reachable by regularly scheduled commercial flight only twice a week, weather allowing. Walk the old base now and you'll find streets of empty military housing, a decommissioned runway built to handle Cold War-era bombers, and buildings left largely as they were the day the mission ended, still marked in places with warnings about buried unexploded ordnance from decades of training exercises that nobody ever finished cleaning up. What keeps the small population there today afloat is plain and simple: fish, not nostalgia. A seafood processing operation runs out of part of the old base infrastructure, buying and processing catch from boats working the surrounding waters, and it's that operation, more than anything left over from the Cold War, that gives the handful of year-round families an actual reason to keep the lights on through winter. Ask one of them what it's like living inside a decommissioned military town, and you're likely to get a shrug and a practical answer about grocery deliveries and the flight schedule, not a ghost story. The old bowling alley and movie theater, if they're mentioned at all, tend to come up as landmarks for giving directions, the same way you'd mention a closed strip mall back home, not as anything worth lowering your voice over. And then there are the caribou. Adak has a resident herd, animals that are not native to the island and never were. The military brought them over in 1958, purely for recreational hunting for the personnel stationed there, and when the base closed, the caribou simply stayed, with nobody left to manage or hunt them at anything close to the original scale. Today they wander a runway built for Cold War-era aircraft, on an island whose human population has shrunk by more than 90% since the base shut down. And it's about as clean an image as you'll find anywhere of a place built entirely around a secret that eventually outlived its own reason to exist. The people who still live in Adak today don't experience any of this as eerie. They experience it as the built environment they grew up walking past on the way to school, which is a fundamentally different relationship to a place than the one a visitor arrives with, camera already up, looking for something strange to point it at. Here's a kind of hiding that took biologists themselves decades to even notice, spread across more than 450 islands at once. And it started with an industry that sounds almost quaint next to war, nuclear tests, and famine: fox fur farming. Between 1836 and 1930, Russian and later American fur farmers released Arctic and red foxes onto island after island across this chain, using the islands themselves as free predator-proof pens, since a fox dropped on an island with no way off simply stayed put until harvest season. The industry peaked in 1929, when more than 400 farmers across Alaska brought in pelts worth roughly $900,000, real money at the time, built almost entirely on turning remote islands into ready-made farms. Nobody involved in that business was thinking about seabirds. But most of these islands had evolved for thousands of years with no ground predators at all, which meant ground-nesting geese and burrow-nesting seabirds, storm petrels, murrelets, puffins by the millions, had never needed to defend a nest against anything that could dig or pounce. The foxes ate them by the millions instead, quietly, island by island, for the better part of a century, with almost nobody outside the fur trade itself paying any attention at all. The Aleutian cackling goose paid the steepest price. By 1963, its entire global breeding range had been squeezed down to a single island, Bull Deer, the only place in the whole chain the foxes had never reached, and by 1967, it was formally listed as an endangered species. The Fish and Wildlife Service began trying to remove foxes from these islands in 1949, trapping and poisoning one island at a time in an effort that would eventually stretch across half a century. And by the early 1990s, foxes had been cleared from 17 islands, though more than 20 others, some of them large, still held populations that took years more to fully remove. Chirikov, the very island with the feral cattle problem covered earlier, carried its own fox population as part of this same story, removed as part of the same decades-long push. One more thread connecting islands that otherwise seemed to have nothing to do with each other. It worked. The Aleutian cackling goose came off the endangered species list entirely in 2001, and today birders describe parts of this chain as reclaiming its old status as one of the great seabird destinations on the continent. That's a genuine rediscovery, hiding in plain sight this whole time inside a story that never needed a single rumor to make it remarkable, an entire archipelago's worth of silent ecological collapse, caused by an industry almost nobody remembers. Reversed island by biologists, most of the country has never heard of either. Not every story on this route is one of collapse, and it's worth pausing here to test that assumption directly, because if isolation out here always ended in emptiness, Umnak Island would be the obvious exception that breaks the pattern. The village of Nikolsky sits atop an archaeological site called Chaluka, showing something close to 4,000 years of nearly continuous human occupation on the same patch of ground. And a related site nearby on Anangula Island has been dated to roughly 8,500 years old. Among the oldest evidence of continuous human presence found anywhere in North America. Layer after layer of shell, bone, and stone tools sit stacked under the modern village, each layer a record of people who built skin-covered boats capable of crossing brutally dangerous open water, who read currents and weather patterns accurately enough to hunt sea mammals from craft that would look impossibly fragile to modern eyes, and who passed that exact knowledge down for roughly 160 consecutive human generations, without ever needing it written down. People have been reading this exact weather, working this exact coastline, and choosing to stay for longer than most of the world's major cities have existed at all. That's worth holding next to everything else on this list, because it means the isolation itself was never the deciding factor in whether a place survives. War ended Attu. A budget line ended Addict's boom years. A famine nearly ended St. Lawrence Island, which is coming up shortly. But the fog, the wind, and the distance that supposedly make this coastline uninhabitable clearly haven't stopped people from living here successfully for thousands of years running. Which should make you suspicious of any explanation that treats the environment itself as the villain of this story, rather than one variable among several. Nikolsky simply never had a war land on it, never had a base built and then defunded, never had its labor conscripted by an outside power the way the Pribilovs did. Strip those specific historical accidents away, and the underlying geography here is perfectly survivable, has been for millennia, and remains so today for the handful of families who still call it home. Not everything empty along this chain was emptied by war, or by a base closure, or by a bomb, either. Some of it was emptied by ordinary economics, one slow season at a time, and the clearest example of that sits on Sainak Island, off the eastern end of the Aleutians, inhabited by Unagan people for something close to 7,000 years before the last residents finally left around 1980. Sanak's history is a chain of one industry after another rising and falling. The sea otter fur trade first, then commercial cod fishing that gave the island real economic stability for roughly 50 years, then salmon, then fox farming, then cattle ranching. When the cod fishery declined in the late 1930s, the local station closed, and residents shifted toward salmon fishing centered on a cannery at a neighboring settlement. Over the following decades, the larger towns that had schools and clinics and churches simply offered a better life than Sainak could, and families made the entirely rational, entirely undramatic choice to leave, one household at a time, until nobody was left behind at all. No battle happened here, no famine, no bomb, no forced removal. Just a community weighing its options over 2 generations and choosing somewhere else. The same calculation any family anywhere makes when the local economy stops working for them. Sainak is managed today as a cultural land trust for the descendants of the people who lived there, still visited for subsistence harvesting and for heritage reasons. Uninhabited, but never abandoned in the sense that actually matters to the families whose grandparents are buried there. If you're looking for the plainest possible proof that isolation out here is sometimes simply a choice people made with open eyes rather than something imposed on them from outside, Sainak is that proof, filed and published in the kind of quiet academic land use study that never once reaches for the word mystery. It's worth naming, too, that staying in a place like this isn't purely a romantic choice made against the numbers, because the numbers themselves are stranger than people assume. Alaska pays every eligible resident an annual dividend out of the state's Oil Wealth Investment Fund, a payment that's run anywhere from several $100s to well over $2,000, depending on the year the legislature settles on, deposited into the account of literally every qualifying resident, regardless of income, Wirramesik Camp, remote village, or downtown Anchorage alike. Set that against the actual cost of living somewhere entirely off the road system, where a single gallon of gasoline or heating fuel in some bush communities has run past $9, and you start to see a more complicated economic picture then isolated equals poor. Some of these communities are cash poor and subsistence rich, trading a grocery store bill most Americans would find genuinely alarming for a freezer full of salmon, seal, or walrus that never appears on any receipt at all. Staying isn't always the harder math. Sometimes it's the community, the language, the family plots, and a version of self-sufficiency that a city dweller would have to relearn from scratch, weighed against conveniences that, out here, come with their own steep and very literal price tag. Ask someone who's actually made that calculation and lived with it for a decade, rather than someone visiting for a week, and the answer rarely sounds like sacrifice. It tends to sound closer to a trade they'd make again. Freezer full and grocery bill light, on a coastline that never once asked their permission to be difficult. Head out into open water now, away from the main chain, toward an island that has nothing to do with war or bases or economics at all, and everything to do with a hard lesson in what happens when a place is left almost entirely alone. St. Matthew Island, roughly 200 miles from anywhere, has no permanent human population, no village, no airstrip anyone maintains, nothing but grass-covered volcanic hills, sea cliffs loud with nesting birds, and weather that makes even the rest of this chain look mild by comparison. Almost nobody visits, almost nobody ever has, and that emptiness is precisely what makes it useful here. It earns its place in this story because of 29 reindeer. In 1944, the United States Coast Guard released 29 reindeer onto St. Matthew Island as a potential emergency food source for a station that was later abandoned entirely, leaving the animals with no predators, no competition, and a layer of lichen across the island that had been building undisturbed for who knows how many decades. The herd exploded. By 1957, it had grown to roughly 1,350 animals. 6 years later, by 1963, it stood at around 6,000, an increase that looked, on paper, like a conservation triumph worth publishing. Biologist David Klein had been studying the herd directly and warned that the island's lichen, the animal's primary winter food source, was being consumed far faster than it could ever regrow under normal conditions. Nobody was in a position to intervene on an island this remote, with no residents to manage the herd and no easy way to reach it, even if someone wanted to try. When Klein returned to the island in the summer of 1966, 3 years after his last visit, he found the herd reduced from 6,000 animals to 42, a single surviving male among them, carrying antlers deformed enough that biologists doubted he could even reproduce successfully. A 99% collapse, almost the entire population wiped out in one brutal winter, 1963 into 1964. After the lichen ran out and a severe season finished what overgrazing had already started months earlier. It remains one of the most extreme, most thoroughly documented population crashes ever recorded for that species anywhere in the world. And it happened specifically because this island was remote enough that nothing intervened. Nothing culled the herd early. Nothing broke the pattern before the pattern broke itself completely and all at once. There's a version of that same lesson that applies well beyond one island full of reindeer, honestly. Any system allowed to grow without a limit anyone's actually watching runs a version of the same experiment, whether it's a herd, a boomtown that's outgrown its own water table, or a fishery nobody's willing to cap until the numbers are already collapsing on their own accord. St. Matthew just happened to run the experiment in total isolation, with one scientist lucky, or unlucky, enough to be present for both the peak and the crash 3 years apart, with nobody else around to see either one happen. Klein kept studying that herd's collapse for years afterward, and the paper he eventually published became one of the most frequently cited case studies in the field of population ecology, taught in university classrooms decades later to students who will likely never set foot anywhere near the Bering Sea. Picture what he actually found on that return trip in 1966. An island carpeted the previous summer with thousands of animals reduced to a scattered handful, carcasses everywhere. The lichen cropped down to bare rock in places it had taken half a century to build back up. No predator did that. No hunter did that. The island simply ran out of what it had to offer, and the herd had no way of knowing to stop asking for more until the asking itself became fatal. That's an uncomfortable kind of hidden truth to sit with. A place quietly demonstrating a rule that applies everywhere, with nobody around who wanted or was able to intervene before the demonstration finished playing out to its end. Every reindeer on that island in 1963 had been born into more food than any of its ancestors had ever seen. On an island with no wolves, no bears, and no competition of any kind. And not one of them had any way of knowing that the abundance itself was the actual threat. South and east of St. Matthew on Unimak Island, the largest island in the entire Aleutian chain and yet one with no permanent settlement of its own, a different kind of hidden mechanism did its damage in a matter of minutes rather than decades. On the 1st of April, 1946, an earthquake estimated at magnitude 8.6 struck beneath the Aleutian Trench. It generated a tsunami that struck Scotch Cap Lighthouse on Unimak's exposed western tip, with a wave reported at more than 130 feet high, taller than a 10-story building, arriving at around 2:18 in the morning with essentially no warning at all. All 5 members of the Coast Guard crew stationed there were killed instantly. Anthony Pettit, the keeper, along with Jack Colvin, Dewey Dykstra, Leonard Pickering, and Paul James Ness, men whose names still appear on a Coast Guard memorial today. The same tsunami crossed the open Pacific and struck Hilo, Hawaii, hours later, killing roughly 159 more people who had no idea anything had happened thousands of miles away on an island most of them couldn't have located on a map. That gap, hours of open ocean between a wave being generated and that same wave making landfall somewhere else with zero warning, is precisely what led directly to the creation of the Pacific Tsunami Warning System in the years that followed, a network that now exists specifically so that no coastline anywhere in that ocean has to learn about a wave the way Hilo learned about this one, in the dark, with no time to run. 5 men died on an island so remote that almost nobody on the mainland even knew the wave existed until it was already crashing into a Hawaiian shoreline hours later. Their deaths are the direct, documented reason a warning system exists today that has since saved uncounted lives elsewhere across that same ocean. That's not a footnote. That's the mechanism working exactly the way this whole investigation keeps finding it work. Isolation doesn't erase a disaster, it just delays who finds out, and how badly that delay ends up costing somewhere else entirely, sometimes on the far side of an ocean. The system built out of that 1946 disaster got tested again far more recently than most people realize. On the night of the 28th of July, 2021, an earthquake measuring 8.2 struck offshore near Chignik on the Alaska Peninsula, not far down the chain from Scotch Cap, the largest earthquake anywhere in the United States in 50 years. This time, the National Tsunami Warning Center issued its first public bulletin within about 5.5 minutes of the shaking starting, placing the Alaska Peninsula under a tsunami warning and pushing advisories out across the eastern Aleutians and southern Alaska before most residents had even finished feeling the ground move. Coastal communities evacuated to high ground as a precaution. The wave that eventually arrived stayed under a foot high, and the warning was downgraded within hours. Nobody died. That's the entire point of naming it here. The same stretch of ocean that killed 5 men without a minute's warning in 1946 produced an equally massive earthquake 75 years later. And this time, the warning reached people before the water did, because 5 names on a Coast Guard memorial had already paid for the system that made that possible. There's one more thing about this exact stretch of water most people would never guess. It's one of the busiest shipping corridors on the entire planet, hiding in plain sight underneath everything else in this film. Unimak Pass, The gap in the chain right beside the lighthouse that failed in 1946 is barely 9 nautical miles wide, and it happens to sit directly on the shortest sea route connecting the west coast of North America to major ports in China, Japan, and South Korea. More than 5,000 vessels a year thread through that narrow gap, container ships and bulk carriers running the same Great Circle route that's carried trans-Pacific trade for decades, passing within sight of the same rocks that killed those 5 Coast Guardsmen, through the same fog and the same wind, almost entirely unnoticed by the millions of people whose imported goods are riding on board. Roughly a dozen ships a day after day, year after year, run this exact gauntlet as a routine part of doing business. Proof that the coastline this whole film keeps calling dangerous and remote is, at the very same time, load-bearing infrastructure for the modern global economy, hiding in the single most literal sense this investigation ever finds. In plain sight, on every shipping manifest, and in the price of ordinary goods on ordinary shelves, never once connected in most people's minds to the specific stretch of water it actually crossed. Turn now toward the open Bering Sea, and toward 2 very different kinds of isolation, because the next 2 stops on this route aren't really about weather at all. They're about where a line got drawn on a map, or a contract got signed, and what that line does to the people standing right next to it every single day. The Pribilof Islands, St. Paul and St. George, sit alone in the middle of the Bering Sea, and their history is built almost entirely on a resource most Americans have never once thought about: fur seals. Somewhere between half and roughly 3/4 of the entire world's population of northern fur seals, depending on which count you trust and which year you're counting, hauls out on these 2 small islands every single summer to breed, which makes St. Paul home to the largest fur seal colony on the planet, packed onto beaches most Americans will never see a single photograph of in their lives. In peak breeding season, those beaches turn into a scene that overwhelms the senses. Bulls several times the size of the females roaring for territory. Pups bleeding for their mothers by the thousand. The smell and noise of it carrying well inland. A wildlife spectacle that would draw crowds anywhere else in the world, and instead plays out here for an audience of researchers, residents, and the occasional determined birder. During the Russian era, Aleut families were forcibly relocated here specifically to harvest seal pelts for a colonial trade they had no say in whatsoever. After the United States purchased Alaska, the harvest continued under a government-controlled contract system, and the pressure on the herds eventually grew severe enough that it produced something without precedent. In 1911, the United States, Great Britain, Japan, and Russia signed the North Pacific Fur Seal Convention, banning open water seal hunting entirely and placing management of the onshore harvest under American jurisdiction. It's widely regarded as the first international treaty ever signed specifically to address a wildlife conservation problem, decades before anything resembling a modern environmental movement existed anywhere in the world, and it exists because of pressure that built up on these 2 small islands and nowhere else. The government contract system it created lasted well into the 1980s, with the island's Aleut residents doing the actual labor under conditions dictated almost entirely from outside, first by St. Petersburg and then by Washington. St. Paul today is one of the largest Aleut communities anywhere, sitting under some of the most persistent fog cover of any inhabited place in the country, overcast or foggy on a clear majority of days across the year. The island's modern economy has leaned heavily on crab fishing, and in recent years that same economy has been shaken hard by an actual measured collapse. Bering Sea snow crab numbers fell from an estimated 11.7 billion animals in 2018 to roughly 1.9 billion by 2022, a decline researchers have tied to a marine heat wave that effectively starved the population by shrinking their cold water habitat and speeding up their metabolism at the same time. In the fall of 2022, regulators canceled the season entirely for the first time in 50 years, on a fishery that had been worth somewhere between $150 and $227 million a year before the crash. A reminder that isolation out here runs well past history books into an ongoing economic exposure that can turn on a single species crashing in water most Americans will never sail across in their lives. What matters most for this investigation, though, is the order things happened in. This isolation wasn't simply discovered by nature and left alone. It was manufactured deliberately by a fur trade that needed cheap, controllable labor in a place nobody else wanted to live. And the community that resulted from that decision has spent generations turning an imposed isolation into an actual home, on their own terms, which is a very different story than the one a rumor about a mysterious island would ever tell you. Further north, near the very top of the Bering Strait, sit the Diomede Islands. And this is where the map itself becomes the thing that's hiding in plain sight. Little Diomede, which belongs to the United States, and Big Diomede, which belongs to Russia, sit just over 2 miles apart at their closest point, roughly 2.4 miles, making them the closest distance between the two countries anywhere on Earth. Because the international dateline runs directly between them, the two islands sit 21 hours apart in local time, which is why they've picked up the names Yesterday Isle and Tomorrow Island. On a clear day, and clear days here are never guaranteed, you can literally stand on Little Diomede and look at tomorrow across a strip of water narrow enough to swim in summer, if the cold didn't make that a lethal idea. The village itself sits wedged onto a narrow terrace at the foot of a mountain of bare granite, because there's almost nowhere else on the island flat enough to build anything at all. Homes stand up on stilts 12 to 15 feet high against the slope, connected by boardwalks instead of streets, with no trees anywhere to break the wind that comes straight off the strait. Even the earliest outside visitors to reach the island, more than a century ago, wrote home describing residents hauling boats and belongings up and down paths cut straight into the cliff face because a flat road was never an option. Geography was willing to offer. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union relocated the Yupik residents of Big Diomede to the Siberian mainland and turned the island into a military installation, sealing the border between two islands close enough to see each other's faces across the strait on a clear morning. Families that had crossed freely between the two communities for generations, sharing language and relatives across a strip of water you could once paddle across in an afternoon, found themselves separated by what came to be called an ice curtain, unable to visit or even communicate for decades at a stretch. It wasn't until 1988, with a brief thaw in relations, that a so-called friendship flight briefly reunited some of those divided families for the first time in 40 years, an event covered on national news at the time and mostly forgotten since. Little Diomedes in Yupiat village today numbers somewhere around 80 residents, reachable mainly by a weekly helicopter run when weather allows it, historically by a runway plowed straight into sea ice. During the months the strait froze solid enough to hold one, a practice that's become steadily less reliable, as that ice has thinned and shortened its season year over year. A genuine and current concern for the families who still live there and are watching their own access to the mainland grow more uncertain rather than more stable with each passing winter. Local and state officials have already begun discussing what a future relocation of the village might look like if the ice keeps thinning at its current pace. The same conversation happening in a handful of other low-lying and ice-dependent Alaska Native communities right now, which means Little Diomedes' isolation is far from a fixed, permanent fact. It's actively changing underfoot in a direction nobody there chose, and nobody there can slow down alone. What actually keeps the village going day to day sits far outside any of that geopolitics. Subsistence hunting, walrus, and seal taken from the water right in front of the village, the way it has been for generations, meat and hide shared through the community rather than sold. A practice protected under federal marine mammal law specifically because it's recognized as a cultural and nutritional necessity rather than a hobby. That's the actual daily rhythm of life on Little Diomede, not a border standoff, and it's precisely the kind of practice locals discuss among themselves in practical terms, when the ice is good enough and when it isn't, rather than performing it for a stranger's camera. The people who live there aren't treating any of this as a Cold War thriller. It's the geography they were born into, a border they can see from their own kitchen window. And the honest reason they don't dramatize it for outsiders is the same reason nobody narrates their own commute in vivid detail. It's just where they live, weather permitting, one day at a time. South of the Strait on St. Lawrence Island sits a piece of history that deserves to be handled with more care than almost anything else in this film. A fully documented catastrophe, not a mystery in any sense of the word. Between 1878 and 1880, a famine struck St. Lawrence Island that killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 people, wiping out all but 2 of the island's villages entirely. Researchers who have reconstructed the event from missionary and naval accounts point to a specific chain of cause. American commercial whalers had already devastated the region's whale populations through decades of overhunting. And when local hunters turned to walrus as a substitute food source, walrus herds collapsed too, hit by that same commercial pressure at almost exactly the wrong moment for the people who depended on them for survival through the winter. Unusual weather patterns disrupted hunting further that particular season, and the arrival of alcohol through trade with outside ships compounded a crisis that was already unfolding before it ever fully arrived on the island. Some estimates put the death toll at well over 90% in the hardest-hit communities, a figure closer to near total collapse than to the 2/3 sometimes cited in older, less careful accounts of the same event. This is not folklore passed down as a scary story for outsiders. It's a documented demographic catastrophe, studied by historians and anthropologists working from written 19th century records left behind by the very ships and missions that witnessed it, and the Yupik communities that exist today on St. Lawrence Island in Savunga and Gamble carry that history as exactly what it is, an ancestral tragedy, remembered on their own terms, inside their own families, not staged for an audience that only wants a chill down its spine. Life in Savunga and Gamble today runs on much the same subsistence base that failed so catastrophically in 1878. Walrus hunted from skin and aluminum boats each spring. Meat and hide shared through the community under a carefully managed federal quota system designed specifically so that history doesn't repeat itself, alongside a genuine, internationally recognized tradition of ivory and baleen carving that turns walrus tusk into some of the most respected indigenous artwork produced anywhere in the state. None of that gets narrated as remarkable by the people doing it. It's simply how a spring works here. The same way planting and harvest simply happen on a farm somewhere else in the country without anyone treating it as a headline. If you're looking for the clearest possible answer to why locals don't talk about what's hiding across these islands the way outsiders expect them to, this is it in its rawest form. Some of what's out here is simply grief, plain and unhidden. And grief doesn't perform on request, no matter how politely it's asked to. Head back south now, toward the Gulf of Alaska, and the last stretch of this route runs straight through the single most violent moment this whole region has produced in modern record, an event that reached Kodiak not as legend, but as a wall of water with almost no warning attached. The same pattern this investigation keeps finding again and again. On Good Friday, the 27th of March, 1964, an earthquake measuring 9.2 struck south-central Alaska, the strongest ever recorded anywhere in American history, and the second strongest ever recorded on Earth with modern instruments. The ground shook for almost 5 minutes straight, long enough that people who lived through it have described losing their sense of which way was up. Across Alaska and down the west coast, The earthquake and the tsunamis it triggered killed roughly 131 people. And here's the detail that matters most for everything this film has been building toward. Only 9 of those deaths came from the shaking itself. Almost all the rest died from the water that followed, water that reached towns along this coast, including downtown Kodiak, with only minutes of warning at best. Kodiak's waterfront was devastated. Boats lifted and dropped blocks from the harbor, buildings gutted, an entire fishing economy knocked flat overnight in a town that had done nothing wrong except sit on a coastline where the ocean floor itself was still settling from a fault line rupture 800 kilometers long. The reason the death toll wasn't dramatically higher, historians studying the event have pointed out, comes down to plain, unglamorous luck. The quake struck in the evening, during the off-season for fishing, on a holiday weekend, when many buildings sat empty. That's not a comforting kind of hidden. That's a coastline that came within a different afternoon, a different tide, a different work schedule, of a far higher body count, and almost nobody outside Alaska remembers it happened at all. Out of exactly that kind of history, Kodiak built the version of itself that exists today, and the next stop on this route is closer to home for most Alaskans than anywhere else on the map so far, and together with what follows, it reframes the whole question one more time. Because what's hiding here isn't secret at all. Some of it is simply large and thick, and everywhere you look, once you know to look for it. And some of it is a live, ongoing argument that's still being decided in a courtroom right now, not something safely tucked into history. Kodiak is home to somewhere around 3,500 brown bears, a subspecies large and distinct enough that biologists classify it separately from mainland brown bears, spread across an archipelago at an average density of under 1 bear per square mile. On paper that sounds sparse. On the ground it means dense alder brush thick enough that a bear weighing well over half a ton can stand 40 feet away and remain completely invisible until it isn't. Locals who live and work on Kodiak aren't secretive about this in the slightest. They talk about it constantly, in exactly the practical, unromantic terms you'd expect from people managing a genuine daily hazard. Which trails to avoid at which time of year, how to store food properly, what to actually do if you round a blind corner into one without warning. What outsiders read as mystery, islanders experience as protocol. The same way anyone who grew up near a busy highway learns to look both ways without consciously thinking about it as a brush with death every single time they cross the street on the way to school. I find that particular contrast more interesting than any single bear encounter could be on its own. The same density of large predators that would headline a nature documentary anywhere else on Earth barely rates a mention in the local paper here, because familiarity, not fear, ends up being the actual long-term relationship between people and something genuinely capable of killing them. Kodiak Town itself sits close enough to good bear habitat that residents sometimes spot one from their own porch, and the response, more often than not, is a photo and a shrug, rather than a call to the news, which tells you plenty about how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary once you actually live beside it. Before Kodiak, though, it's worth naming a mechanism that's been quietly operating underneath more than half of the islands already covered, because it's the closest thing on this whole route to an actual legal wall. And almost nobody outside Alaska has ever heard of the law that built it. In 1971, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, the largest land claim settlement in American history, extinguishing Alaska Native claims to more than 360 million acres in exchange for roughly 44 million acres of land conveyed to newly created Native corporations, split between 12 regional corporations and more than 200 village corporations, plus a 13th regional corporation for Alaska Natives living outside the state. Village corporations generally hold the surface of their land. Regional corporations generally hold what's underneath it, and across the Aleutian and Bering Sea region, an enormous share of the land you've been hearing about all through this film. Village sites, fishing grounds, whole islands in some cases, is owned outright by one of these corporations rather than by the federal government at all. That means access in a lot of these places comes down to ordinary private property law rather than permits and rangers. The same law that would require anyone needing permission to walk across a neighbor's field back home. It's not secrecy, it's title, recorded at a courthouse, held by shareholders who are themselves the descendants of the people this whole film has been following. The Aleut Corporation alone, the regional entity covering most of the islands in this film, holds something like 1.6 million acres between surface and subsurface rights, owned by more than 5,000 shareholders, most of them Aleut by descent. When a village here feels closed off to outsiders, the reason is very often the same reason your own hometown would feel closed off to a stranger who showed up trying to walk through somebody's backyard uninvited. Every shareholder in that corporation has a direct financial stake in exactly how and whether an outside visitor gets to set foot on land their own family has held for over half a century now, which turns a question that sounds cultural or mysterious from a distance into something closer to an ordinary annual meeting agenda item once you're actually standing inside the room where it gets decided. A short distance offshore sits Chirikov Island, home to several hundred feral cattle descended from Russian Aristock brought over more than a century ago, animals that historically had to swim ashore, because the island has no harbor at all for any boat to safely land in. Ranching there ended around the turn of this century when a federal grazing lease wasn't renewed, and the island now falls under a national wildlife refuge with access tightly restricted, not because anyone is concealing anything, but because there's almost no practical reason for anyone to go there anymore. And a herd of wild cattle has had the run of the place for 2 full decades as a direct result of that ordinary bureaucratic decision made by people who never set out to create a mystery in the first place. Wildlife managers who do get out there periodically have found something the ranchers never had reason to worry about back when the island still turned a profit. Unmanaged grazing has stripped vegetation down to bare ground in places, and the resulting erosion is damaging Alutiiq cultural heritage sites left by people who lived on this island for something like 5,000 years before any rancher ever set foot on it. That's a real active tension out here, not a legend. A herd nobody planned to leave behind is quietly wearing away ground that holds thousands of years of human history. And there's no tidy solution sitting on a shelf that fixes both problems at once. Photographs taken by the biologists who do make the trip show something almost surreal to look at. Cattle grazing calmly across open grassland with no fence, no road, and no other sign of humanity in any direction. Animals that have been feral for so many generations now that almost none of them have ever laid eyes on a person up close, living out entire lives on a patch of ground most of their own country doesn't know exists. And then there's King Cove. And King Cove is the clearest example on this entire route of what happens when a rule of place stops being an interesting fact and becomes a matter of life and death that people are actively arguing about in the present tense right now, in an unresolved fight that's still playing out. King Cove is a community of roughly 750 people on the Alaska Peninsula, and it sits close to, but not close enough to, a legacy military airstrip in the neighboring town of Cold Bay that's long enough and equipped enough to handle the kind of jet aircraft that a serious medical emergency actually requires. That runway dates back to 1942, built as an Army airfield during the same Aleutian campaign that opened this film, stretching well over 10,000 feet today, among the longest in the entire state, kept alive ever since, largely as an emergency stop for aircraft crossing the Pacific on that same Great Circle route. Between King Cove and that airstrip lies Izembek National Wildlife Refuge, protected wilderness built around a lagoon, whose eelgrass beds draw nearly the entire world population of the Pacific black brant, something in the neighborhood of 135,000 geese arriving from as far away as Russia and Canada, feeding for weeks before continuing on a 3,000-mile migration south toward Mexico, along with brown bears and a wetland ecosystem specifically protected under federal conservation law precisely because so much of a single species' survival funnels through this one stretch of coastline and nowhere else on Earth. For decades, King Cove residents facing a genuine medical emergency have depended on small aircraft or Coast Guard helicopters to fly them out in weather that, given everything you now understand about this region, is very often exactly the kind of weather that makes flying close to impossible. Since 2013 alone, King Cove has required more than 257 medical evacuations, a huge share of them carried out in dangerous conditions, several of them flown by Coast Guard crews risking their own lives on top of the patients. Residents and their supporters have pushed for decades to build a gravel road, roughly 19 miles long, connecting King Cove directly to that all-weather airstrip at Cold Bay, arguing plainly that people have died waiting on weather that a short road could have made irrelevant. Conservation groups and several tribal organizations have opposed it just as hard, arguing that a road cutting through the refuge threatens critical habitat for migratory birds and the broader ecosystem that depends on that land staying intact and undisturbed. Both sides have real, documented, defensible evidence behind their position, which is exactly why this fight has run for decades, through multiple presidential administrations, several land exchange agreements, and, most recently, active lawsuits still working their way through federal court over whether construction can even legally proceed. I'll be honest, this is the one stop on this whole route where I don't think there's a clean answer to reach for. A migratory bird population that funnels its entire existence through one lagoon deserves real protection. And so does a person having a heart attack at 2 in the morning in weather no aircraft can safely fly through. 257 medevacs is not an abstraction to the families who lived through each one. And neither is a wetland that took thousands of years to become what it is. There is no tidier way to end this particular story, because it hasn't ended yet. But it's the single clearest illustration available anywhere on this route of the fact that informed choice to avoid a place and trapped by a place with nowhere safe to turn can describe the exact same coastline, the exact same weather, and the exact same 750 people, depending entirely on which emergency happens to be unfolding on a given night. King Cove's medevac crisis is specifically about the emergencies a small clinic can't handle alone. And it's worth balancing that against the system rural Alaska actually built for everything short of that. Since the late 1960s, a network called the Community Health Aid Program has trained local residents, chosen by their own villages, to serve as the frontline medical provider in communities with no doctor and no hospital of their own, working from a detailed treatment manual and staying in contact with physicians in regional hub towns by phone or video. Today, something like 550 of these community health aides cover more than 170 villages across the state, most of them in places every bit as remote as the islands in this film. It's a homegrown solution, built specifically because waiting on outside help wasn't going to cut it, and it handles the overwhelming majority of what actually walks through a village clinic door. King Cove's fight is about the rare, severe case that even a well-trained local aide can't manage alone. The other 90-some% of the time, the system rural Alaska built for itself is already working, quietly, exactly the way it's supposed to. One more stop belongs here before the ferry, because it shows exactly how far modern engineering can go to solve a problem that fog and geography keep creating in the first place. Akutan is home to the largest seafood processing plant in North America, run by Trident Seafoods. A facility that can process well over 100 million pounds of fish in a season, employing more workers at times than the village itself has residents. And yet for decades, the only way in or out was by amphibious float plane landing directly on the water, weather permitting, or by boat, weather permitting, or by helicopter, weather permitting. The the same three-way condition that's followed nearly every single stop on this entire route. The state eventually spent tens of millions of dollars building a proper airport, but it had to be built on the neighboring island of Akun, because Akutan itself has nowhere flat enough or stable enough to hold a runway. That meant adding a hovercraft, a genuine hovercraft, to ferry passengers and freight the short distance across the strait between the new runway and the actual village. A system so exposed to wind and swell that the hovercraft itself was frequently grounded by the exact conditions it was built to operate through. One of the largest seafood operations on the entire continent runs behind a transportation chain that a small child could describe as absurd, and nobody involved designed it badly on purpose. It stands as the most expensive, most heavily engineered proof available anywhere on this coastline that geography here doesn't negotiate, no matter how much money or ingenuity gets thrown at it. Every fillet processed on that island, headed for a grocery store shelf or a restaurant plate somewhere in the lower 48, made at least part of its journey by hovercraft, a detail that would sound invented if it weren't so thoroughly documented in the state's own transportation records. And getting to any of these places at all, once you actually try to plan the trip, rather than just imagine it from a distance, is its own kind of answer to the question this whole film keeps circling back to. The Alaska Marine Highway runs a single ferry, the Tustumena, out toward the eastern edge of this chain, a vessel that regularly encounters some of the roughest water anywhere on the planet on a round trip that can run close to a week from Kodiak out to Dutch Harbor and back, stopping at isolated fishing villages along the way. With winter weather routinely cutting service to the smaller stops entirely for months at a stretch every single year, there is no other road out here, not one, and no bridge connecting any of it to anything else. Every single community named in this film, without exception, is reachable only by boat or by plane, and every one of those planes and boats answers to the same wind that opened this whole investigation. For most of this coastline, there has never been a moment in history when you could simply decide to drive there on a whim. That single logistical fact, more than any legend, more than any classified radar station, is probably the single largest reason this entire stretch of the United States remains as unfamiliar to everyone else as it does. It was never hidden from anyone on purpose. It was just never made easy to reach, and easy is doing almost all of the real work in how a place ends up known or unknown to people who've never once had to plan a trip around a weather window instead of a simple departure time on a printed schedule. Step back and look at the whole chain at once for a moment, because the raw numbers make the point better than any single island can on its own. Out of roughly 300 islands and islets strung across this arc, fewer than a dozen communities remain occupied today. Unalaska, the largest, holds something like 4,700 people. Across the entire region, something on the order of 1,700 Unangaks live in the communities that still exist, a population spread thin across a coastline that used to support many more villages than survive now, before war, relocation, and hard economics did their work. That's a small, real, countable population, not a hidden one, living across an area roughly the length of the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, and the emptiness in between amounts to nothing more sinister than what's left standing after every single mechanism this film has walked through took its turn. What surprised me most, putting this whole route together, wasn't any single fact. It was how rarely the explanations overlapped. A viewer expecting one grand unifying secret behind every empty island on this list is going to be disappointed, and that disappointment is itself the honest answer. Attu emptied for one specific reason, Kiska for another. Adak, Amchitka, Sanak, St. Matthew, all different mechanisms, different decades, different decision makers, none of them coordinating with each other, none of them hiding the same thing. The only real thread running underneath all of it is the coastline itself. indifferent to whichever specific disaster, industry, or war happened to be passing through it that decade. A place doesn't need a single conspiracy to stay unfamiliar. It just needs a dozen small, disconnected, entirely ordinary reasons, stacked up one after another over a century and a half, until the sheer number of them starts to feel, from the outside, like it must be adding up to something bigger than it actually is. So gather up everything this route has actually turned up, because it's time to test the assumptions we opened with against the record instead of against a rumor. Is anything here actually hidden by design, by a cover-up, by some deliberate withholding of information from the public? Go back through every single stop one more time and check. Attu's emptiness is a paper trail, a wartime capture, a POW camp, a post-war decision not to fund a rebuild. Kiska's silence is an engineering hazard report about unexploded ordnance, filed in public for anyone who cares enough to request it. The Battle of the Pips is a logged naval action report, ammunition expenditure and all, hiding nothing except its own embarrassment. Shemia's silence is a security clearance, real, but bounded and accountable. Not a rumor with no author anyone could ever name. Amchitka's silence is a radiological monitoring program, published in environmental review after environmental review for decades running. Attic's Ghost Town is a Cold War budget line that got cut in 1997 and reported in the newspaper the same week it happened. Nikolsky proves the environment alone was never the deciding factor to begin with. Atka is a resettlement record and a living village phone book. Sanak's emptiness is a land use study built from interviews with the very families who chose to leave on their own terms. The Fox and the Goose are a Wildlife Service annual report, one island's fur ledger next to another island's recovery numbers. St. Matthew's reindeer are a peer-reviewed wildlife study, cited in ecology textbooks decades later. Akutan's hovercraft is a state transportation budget line item, expensive and public. The land under half these communities is a corporate title search away from anyone curious enough to look it up. Scotch Cap is a Coast Guard casualty list and the founding charter of a tsunami warning agency that still operates today, right now, across the whole Pacific. The Pribilofs are a documented labor history and the origin of the first international wildlife treaty ever signed, plus a fisheries story running in the news at this very moment. Little Diomede is a border, drawn and defended in plain sight on every map printed since the Cold War began. St. Lawrence Island is a demographic catastrophe, reconstructed from written 19th century records left by outside witnesses. And King Cove sits outside history altogether. An active federal lawsuit with a docket number you could look up yourself this afternoon. The 1964 earthquake and the wave that hit Kodiak are seismograph traces and a hospital's own admission logs. The land bridge that first brought people across these same waters is an entire, independently corroborated field of archaeology. The Bering Sea crab fleet's death toll and the specific regulation that brought it down sit in federal labor statistics anyone can request. None of it required a conspiracy. All of it required only distance, weather, time, and occasionally a hard trade-off between two things people actually care about, which turn out to be far more effective at concealment than any deliberate secret ever needs to be. Because nobody has to guard a fact that almost nobody can physically reach in the first place. And here's the piece that took the longest to actually see clearly, even after gathering all of this together in one place. The silence from the people who live there is a separate, entirely reasonable response to the isolation, not the same thing as the concealment itself. Weather that governs your whole week gets checked out of habit, the way anyone checks a forecast before deciding whether the skiff goes out, not treated as a story worth telling a stranger. Unexploded ordnance you learned to route around as a kid turns into a hazard sign you stopped consciously noticing decades ago, the same way you stopped noticing a stop sign on your own block after the 10,000th time you've driven past it. A famine Your great-grandparents survived becomes a name spoken about carefully inside the family, when it's spoken about at all, never handed to a stranger holding a microphone and hoping for a good clip. Land Your Own Corporation owns and manages under a 1971 Federal Settlement Act gets handled the same practical way anyone handles property that's actually theirs, filed paperwork rather than performed mystery. A medevac fight that's put someone you know on a helicopter in bad weather is the worst night of that family's year, carried with exactly the weight it deserves, and not 1 ounce more for an audience. Subsistence hunting runs on the same register as a garden back home. Tuesday's dinner and next winter's stores, managed under a quota system the community itself helped negotiate, discussed among neighbors in plain, unromantic terms. Every single one of these silences has an honest, specific, entirely undramatic explanation once you actually ask the right person the right way, which is exactly why almost nobody who is asked in person, patiently, respectfully, has ever come back reporting a genuine cover-up. They've come back instead with more of what you just heard across the last stretch of this film: documented history, hard-won local knowledge, and communities who have simply made their peace with living somewhere that costs the rest of us real, sustained effort, even to picture accurately in our own heads. That effort is exactly what a rumor skips. A cover-up story asks nothing of the listener beyond a shiver. The actual record, 6 camps and their death tolls, a treaty from 1911, a reindeer herd's collapse, a road nobody can agree on, asks you to hold a dozen unrelated facts in your head at once and resist the urge to braid them into a single tidy villain. Most people, understandably, take the shiver instead. If there's a version of rediscovery worth landing on here, it isn't that something monstrous was hiding out past Kodiak all along, waiting patiently to be found by the right camera crew with the right lighting. The closest thing to an actual monster on this entire route turned out to be a small, unremarkable fox, dropped onto island after island by people chasing a fur price, quietly erasing seabirds by the million across nearly 100 years before anyone noticed and started patiently, island by island, trap by trap, taking the damage back. That's the shape rediscovery actually takes out here. Not a reveal, a repair, run by people whose names never made the news, that took decades and mostly worked. It's that an entire working knowledge of how to survive in one of the most physically demanding stretches of coastline on the planet has been sitting in plain sight the whole time, carried by people who never needed to dramatize it because they were too busy actually living it, one ordinary day after another, for generations. The fog that swallows an island for the better part of a year isn't a mystery to the person who reads its patterns before deciding whether to launch a boat that morning. The wind that can flip a plane without warning isn't folklore to the pilot who's learned exactly which ridgelines to give a wider berth on a bad day and which ones are usually fine. The volcano nobody's watching with an instrument isn't a hidden threat to the fishing crew who's learned to glance at it out of habit every time they round that headland. Atka took in families it had never met and simply carried on. Somewhere off Kiska right now, a piece of a ship that sat lost for 75 years is finally cataloged, measured, and understood. Proof that even the parts of this story buried underwater eventually surface, if enough people keep looking. 17 islands worth of foxes got trapped out one winter at a time by biologists nobody remembers the names of, until a goose that had been pushed down to a single last island came back from the edge of extinction entirely. What outside observers keep missing isn't some hidden truth about the islands themselves. It's the plain fact that the people who actually live there have already solved the puzzle everyone else keeps trying to dramatize, and they solved it generations ago, quietly, the way most real expertise gets built anywhere on Earth. Not through a single dramatic revelation, but through thousands of ordinary days spent paying close attention to a place that does not forgive carelessness, and never once needed an audience watching to keep doing it right anyway. The rediscovery here belongs to whoever's willing to sit with a dozen separate answers instead of one satisfying one, and to notice that the people who've known those answers the longest were never the ones keeping them from you. Go back to where we started, to that wind with a name and no warning. It's still out there right now, moving down some ridge on some island most of the country has never heard of, deciding in real time whether a boat goes out today or stays tied to the dock until conditions ease up tomorrow. Somewhere under that same wind, a pilot is checking a forecast that will be out of date in an hour. A fisherman is watching a barometer instead of a phone. And a kid on Little Diomede is looking across 2.5 miles of water at a country that used to be reachable on foot. None of them are performing for an audience that isn't there. They're simply living the way people have lived along this exact stretch of coastline for thousands of years before anyone thought to call it remote. Nobody's hiding it from you. It was always right there on the map, sitting exactly where you'd expect it, along a stretch of American coastline that simply asks more of anyone who wants to understand it than a headline, or a rumor, or a 5-minute video ever really could, out of everywhere we just covered. Which island would you actually want to stand on yourself, fog and all? And which one would you keep a healthy distance from no matter what anyone offered you? Tell me straight in the comments, not the polite answer, because more than one of these had me going back and forth right up to the end. A like tells me the fog versus folklore split actually landed, and subscribing keeps you on this coastline for whatever gets uncovered next.